The transition from rivalry to confrontation did not arrive with an announcement. It settled in gradually, like static building in the air before a storm. By the second week of April, the Pacific had begun to operate on a new rhythm. Shipping routes adjusted quietly. Satellite tasking cycles intensified. Civilian flights altered their paths by degrees small enough to avoid headlines. The routines of peace remained visible, but beneath them new patterns formed. At 0421 UTC on April 14th, a U.S. surveillance satellite registered an unusual dispersal of signals across the Western Pacific. The data did not indicate an attack, it suggested alignment. Japanese naval communication networks, previously segmented, began synchronizing with American command relays in a way that had not occurred outside of joint exercises. The integration was temporary, provisional, and carefully deniable. Still, analysts in multiple countries marked the moment. Systems built for contingency were moving toward continuity. Japan's government did not issue a declaration. Instead, maritime authorities expanded exclusion advisories around several island chains south of Kyushu. Officially, the warnings concerned hazardous military testing. Commercial vessels were advised to maintain distance. Insurance firms adjusted premiums overnight. Shipping companies rerouted traffic with minimal explanation. The Pacific's vastness absorbed the changes without visible disruption, but the map of risk had shifted. On April 16th, the first confirmed collision of interests occurred. A U.S. destroyer conducting a routine freedom of navigation transit east of Okinawa detected persistent radar illumination from an unidentified source. The signal held steady for 11 minutes, then vanished. Japanese air defense stations reported similar contacts across multiple sectors. None escalated to weapons systems, no shots were fired. Yet for the first time in decades, U.S. and Japanese forces operated under shared engagement protocols outside a declared exercise window. Across the region, other actors noticed. Satellite imagery captured increased activity at several Chinese coastal bases. Long-range radar arrays shifted orientation. Air patrol frequencies doubled. No official statements followed. Diplomacy remained publicly calm. Privately, communication channels filled with questions that received no answers. The first public incident occurred on April 18th at 0933 local time. A Japanese reconnaissance drone operating near disputed airspace lost contact abruptly. Telemetry indicated a sudden power failure followed by uncontrolled descent. Debris fell into open water. Within hours, anonymous footage surfaced online showing a high-altitude intercept by an unidentified fighter. The video disappeared almost immediately. Governments issued no confirmation. Still, the narrative took shape. The region's invisible boundaries were becoming visible through action. In Washington, defense planners initiated what they termed adaptive alignment. Carrier strike groups already deployed in the Pacific were repositioned by small increments, each adjustment defensible as routine. In Tokyo, reserve mobilization procedures moved from theoretical to practical. Personnel received notifications framed as readiness drills. Civil defense authorities updated emergency broadcast scripts for the first time in a generation. The language remained cautious, the implications did not. April 20th marked the first coordinated cyber disruption. At 0214 UTC, port logistics systems in Yokohama experienced simultaneous data corruption across multiple terminals. Cranes halted mid-operation, container manifests scrambled. Within minutes, similar anomalies appeared in Honolulu and San Diego. None caused permanent damage, all resolved within hours. Attribution remained unconfirmed, yet the pattern was unmistakable. The infrastructure of trade had been tested and found permeable. Financial markets reacted before governments did. Shipping stocks dipped. Energy futures rose. Insurance models recalibrated risk across the Pacific Basin. The economic front of the conflict began forming before any kinetic exchange occurred. On April 22nd, a joint U.S.-Japan task force assembled east of the Ryukyu chain under strict emissions control. The formation included destroyers, submarines, and support vessels operating without public acknowledgement. Satellite detection confirmed their presence within 48 hours. Once detected, the task force did not disperse. It remained in position, a signal delivered without words. Chinese naval units shadowed the formation at a distance beyond engagement range. Aircraft flew parallel courses, radar locks flickered briefly, then disengaged. The choreography resembled a negotiation conducted through sensors rather than diplomats. For 17 hours, the two forces maneuvered within proximity. No weapons armed, no shots fired, yet the balance of restraint narrowed. The first casualty did not occur at sea. On April 24th, a coordinated cyber intrusion struck electrical infrastructure in northern Japan. Power outages cascaded through several prefectures for 46 minutes. Emergency systems activated successfully. Civilian disruption remained limited, but the psychological effect was immediate. Public messaging urged calm. Privately, officials acknowledged the breach as a warning. The United States responded not with force, but with visibility. Satellite imagery of multiple Pacific installations was declassified and released publicly, demonstrating awareness of opposing deployments. The message was subtle but clear. Nothing occurring in the region was unseen. Surveillance had become a form of deterrence. On April 26th, the first direct confrontation occurred. A U.S. reconnaissance aircraft operating in international airspace reported aggressive interception by multiple Japanese fighters after a navigational deviation brought it closer to restricted zones than intended. Communications between the aircraft and interceptors grew tense. Warning flares deployed. The American plane altered course and withdrew. No missiles fired, yet the incident marked a shift. Allies were no longer operating in seamless alignment. Friction had entered the partnership itself, driven by uncertainty and mistrust. Within hours, diplomatic channels activated at emergency levels. Public statements framed the encounter as a misunderstanding. Military planners on both sides treated it as something else entirely, evidence that coordination protocols were failing under pressure. The possibility of miscalculation now exceeded the margin of control. On April 27th at 1850 UTC, an undersea communication cable linking Japan to U.S. Pacific Command experienced a sudden signal loss. No explosion detected, no seismic disturbance recorded. Data traffic rerouted automatically through secondary lines. The interruption lasted 23 minutes. In military terms, 23 minutes was an eternity. During that window, both nations operated with degraded communication across key sectors. When the link restored, neither side publicly acknowledged the outage. Both sides adjusted operational posture immediately. By the end of April, civilian awareness had begun to catch up with military reality. News outlets reported increased patrols and heightened readiness without naming adversaries. Governments urged resilience and preparedness. Emergency supply purchases rose quietly across multiple cities. The world sensed motion without understanding its direction. The decisive shift occurred on April 30th. At 0712 UTC, a U.S. destroyer detected multiple high-speed contacts approaching from the northwest. Initial identification suggested civilian vessels. As distance closed, the signatures changed. Unmanned surface drones accelerated toward the formation. Defensive systems engaged automatically. 2 drones destroyed, a third detonated against the hull, causing limited structural damage and minor casualties. No group claimed responsibility, no government admitted involvement, yet the line between covert action and open conflict had been crossed. Japan elevated its national defense posture to its highest level since the mid-21st century. The United States moved additional assets into the region under emergency authorization. Diplomatic communication continued, but its tone shifted from negotiation to containment. Each side now assumed the other was preparing for the worst, while hoping to avoid it. By May 1st, the Pacific operated under a new reality. Patrol schedules stabilized into wartime patterns. Cyber operations followed predictable cycles. Satellite constellations repositioned for sustained surveillance. The extraordinary had become procedural. The opening phase of the Third World War had begun, not with an explosion, but with alignment, miscalculation, and the slow erosion of restraint. The shift from confrontation to sustained conflict did not arrive with a declaration. It settled through repetition. By the first week of May, patrol cycles had stabilized across the Western Pacific. Surveillance orbits overlapped continuously. Naval formations rotated through contested waters on schedules that resembled logistics rather than deterrence. The war had not been announced, but it had begun to operate like one. On May 2nd at 03:18 UTC, a joint U.S.-Japan submarine patrol detected unusual acoustic signatures south of Okinawa. The sounds did not match known submarine profiles. They resembled coordinated movement, dozens of small autonomous underwater vehicles traveling in a loose grid. The pattern suggested mapping behavior, possibly for undersea cables or future mines. The submarine withdrew without engagement and transmitted a full-spectrum scan. Within hours, both governments elevated readiness levels. Air patrol frequencies doubled, missile defense systems shifted to active monitoring. Civil defense agencies in several Pacific cities issued precautionary advisories. The war had moved beyond ambiguity. On May 7th, the first major cyber strike against civilian infrastructure occurred. Simultaneous intrusions disrupted rail signaling across multiple Japanese prefectures and portions of the U.S. West Coast. Trains halted mid-route, traffic control systems froze, airports delayed departures. The disruptions lasted under an hour, but the psychological effect was profound. Civilians experienced the war not through headlines, but through interruption of daily life. Financial markets reacted sharply. Shipping insurance across the Pacific surged, energy prices spiked, governments began quiet consultations on rationing contingencies. The economic dimension of the conflict accelerated faster than the military one. On May 8th, coalition dynamics shifted. Australia and the United Kingdom announced increased naval presence in the region under joint security frameworks. Their forces did not engage directly. They positioned themselves within support range of U.S. and Japanese operations. The Pacific's operational grid expanded. The war was no longer bilateral, it was becoming multinational. That same day, space-based assets experienced their first major disruption. A U.S. communications satellite reported repeated close approach maneuvers by an unidentified inspection satellite. The object did not collide, it passed within meters, altering its orbit in ways that suggested deliberate testing. Hours later, the American satellite suffered a temporary orientation failure, disrupting secure communications across several naval sectors for 14 minutes. The outage forced commanders to revert to backup channels designed decades earlier. Human judgment returned to a battlefield increasingly dominated by machines. On May 9th at 22:03 UTC, an American tanker aircraft operating east of Japan reported missile lock warnings from multiple directions. Countermeasures deployed automatically, no missiles fired. The aircraft withdrew under escort. The incident lasted 90 seconds. It altered planning for weeks. Air operations shifted farther east. Patrol corridors widened. The margin for error narrowed further. The first large-scale engagement began on May 10th. A mixed formation of U.S., Japanese, and Allied ships encountered an opposing surface group south of Okinawa. Both sides maneuvered aggressively while maintaining distance. Jammers activated. Radar systems painted targets briefly, then disengaged. Aircraft performed simulated attack runs without releasing ordnance. The standoff continued for 13 hours. At 1941 local time, a single missile launched from the opposing formation. It detonated at high altitude, scattering debris designed to disrupt sensors. The coalition responded immediately. 2 interceptors destroyed the debris field before it could interfere with navigation systems. No ships struck, yet the sky over the Pacific lit with controlled explosions. The war had entered the kinetic phase without direct hits. On May 11th, global shipping insurers withdrew coverage from several Pacific routes. Commercial traffic rerouted towards longer paths. Supply chains slowed. Governments began releasing strategic reserves. Citizens noticed empty shelves in some regions. The war was no longer distant. By mid-May, routines had hardened. Patrol schedules stabilized into wartime cycles. Cyber strikes followed predictable patterns. Casualties mounted slowly, often hidden behind technical language. Leaders spoke of restraint while authorizing broader engagement authority. Systems designed to prevent war were now managing it.
The second phase of the Third World War had begun not with a decisive battle, but with accumulation, each incident layered upon the last, each response calibrated to avoid catastrophe while inching closer to it. The Pacific had become a space of controlled collisions, where damage was inflicted carefully, deliberately, and always just short of the threshold everyone feared crossing.
By mid-May, the operational tempo reached a level once considered unsustainable. Yet the systems held. Crews rotated through deployments with mechanical precision. Drones replaced pilots in the most contested airspace. Decision windows compressed from minutes to seconds. The war did not explode outward, it tightened inward, like a mechanism winding itself beyond safe tolerance. On May 12 at 02:26 UTC, a Japanese coastal radar station detected a cluster of fast-moving objects approaching from the southeast at extremely low altitude. Initial identification suggested weather interference. Seconds later, thermal signatures confirmed multiple sea-skimming drones. The station transmitted an automated warning to nearby naval units. Defensive systems engaged before human operators could verify targets. 4 drones destroyed. One slipped through and detonated near a patrol vessel anchored offshore. The explosion breached the hull and ignited fuel lines. Damage control teams contained the fire within 30 minutes. 3 sailors were killed. It was the first confirmed military fatality publicly acknowledged by Japan since the conflict began. The government released the information within hours. The statement was brief and carefully worded. It did not assign blame. It did not use the word war. Yet the public reaction was immediate. Civil defense broadcasts returned to television and radio. Emergency supply guidance circulated across major cities. Subway systems in Tokyo conducted overnight readiness drills. For the first time in generations, the population prepared for sustained conflict rather than temporary crisis. The United States responded with reinforcement. Additional aircraft and naval assets moved into the Philippine Sea under emergency authorization. The deployments were announced openly, framed as support for regional stability. Behind the language, command structures shifted into wartime coordination. Joint operations centers operated continuously. Decision authority for defensive action expanded further. The margin between response and escalation narrowed again. On May 13th, the undersea domain destabilized. A major fiber optic cable connecting Japan to U.S. Pacific Command experienced a sudden signal loss. No seismic event recorded, no explosion detected. Data traffic rerouted automatically through alternative pathways, but latency spiked across secure military channels. For 11 minutes, missile defense systems operated with delayed targeting updates measured in milliseconds. For civilian networks, the disruption was negligible. For military systems, it was unacceptable. Engineers later described the event as precise interference rather than physical destruction. Attribution remained unconfirmed. Suspicion did not. That same day, satellite tracking identified increased movement among Japanese ground forces on several southern islands. Missile batteries repositioned, air defense units redeployed. The movements were defensive, but their scale suggested anticipation of direct strikes. Across the Pacific, similar adjustments occurred. Each side prepared for escalation while insisting publicly on restraint. The first large-scale air engagement unfolded over open water east of Taiwan. A mixed formation of U.S. and Japanese aircraft conducted a patrol along a newly established security corridor. Multiple unidentified fighters approached at high speed. Radar locks formed. Jamming intensified across all frequencies. For 38 seconds, missile launch indicators flashed across multiple aircraft simultaneously. Countermeasures deployed, no missiles fired. Then, abruptly, all locks disengaged. The opposing formation turned away. The encounter ended without physical damage. Yet pilots later described it as the closest moment to open aerial combat in decades. Back on the ground, political pressure mounted. Legislatures in both countries authorized expanded emergency powers. Industrial production shifted toward military supply chains. Shipping companies received government directives regarding priority cargo. Civilian industries adjusted quietly. The war economy began forming before formal declarations caught up. On May 15th at 1903 local time, the conflict expanded into space. A Japanese reconnaissance satellite reported repeated close approach maneuvers by an unidentified object matching the profile of a maneuverable inspection platform. The satellite altered its orbit to avoid collision.
Hours later, its communication systems experienced a temporary blackout lasting 47 seconds. During that interval, secure data transmission across several naval sectors degraded. The blackout resolved automatically. The precedent remained. Space had become an active theater. The most dangerous moment arrived on May 16th. Early warning systems in both countries detected anomalous launch signatures from multiple coastal regions. For 6 minutes, analysts could not determine whether the signals represented missile tests, sensor errors, or the beginning of a coordinated strike. Strategic forces elevated readiness. Submarines received coded transmissions. Aircraft crews prepared for rapid launch. Then the signatures vanished. Later analysis suggested a cascade sensor malfunction triggered by orbital debris. The explanation mattered less than the reaction. For 6 minutes, the world stood at the edge of irreversible escalation without any deliberate attack. Afterward, communication channels reopened cautiously. Emergency diplomatic messages moved through neutral intermediaries. Language softened. Phrases like deconfliction and mutual restraint reappeared in official statements. Yet the fighting did not stop. It continued in smaller, more controlled forms, each incident testing boundaries without crossing the final line. On May 17th, coordinated cyber attacks struck port infrastructure in Los Angeles, Yokohama, and Busan simultaneously. Cargo manifests corrupted. Automated cranes halted mid-operation. Shipping schedules collapsed across multiple regions. The disruptions lasted less than 12 hours but rippled through global trade for days. Governments began releasing strategic reserves of fuel and critical materials. The economic front intensified. Inside both nations, public messaging shifted from reassurance to endurance. Emergency broadcast systems advised citizens to prepare for prolonged disruption. Schools conducted evacuation drills. Hospitals reviewed mass casualty procedures. The war had not reached major population centers physically, but psychologically it had already arrived. On May 18th at 0842 UTC, a U.S. naval convoy escorting supply vessels east of the Ryukyu chain detected multiple fast-moving aerial contacts approaching from high altitude. Defensive systems activated automatically. Interceptors launched. One incoming object destroyed at range. Another slipped through the defensive envelope and detonated in proximity to a support ship, causing structural damage and several injuries. The convoy continued moving. No ships lost. Casualty reports suppressed initially, then confirmed later. Each incident eroded restraint further. By late May, the distinction between preparation and execution vanished. Units once described as exercising were now operating continuously. Logistics hubs shifted from redundancy to survival. The conflict had hardened into a pattern of daily engagements calibrated to avoid total war while making total war increasingly likely. On May 20th, Japan formally invoked expanded defense coordination with the United States, integrating command structures more deeply than at any point in modern history. The announcement was framed as precautionary. In practice, it marked the transition from alliance support to unified wartime posture. Additional allied nations signaled readiness to contribute logistical and intelligence support. The Pacific's strategic map expanded again. The largest naval confrontation yet occurred on May 20th east of Okinawa. Multiple surface combatants from both sides maneuvered within overlapping engagement zones. Missiles were armed, but not fired. Radar locks held longer than before. Jamming filled the electromagnetic spectrum. For nearly 16 hours, the fleets remained in proximity, each calculating the consequences of the first strike. Finally, one missile launched, its trajectory arcing high above the water before detonating harmlessly at altitude. A warning shot, a demonstration, a controlled collision. No direct hits followed. Both sides disengaged slowly. The standoff ended without decisive outcome. Yet the implications were clear. The war could now erupt at any moment, from any miscalculation, from any automated system reacting faster than human oversight allowed. By the end of May's third week, the world understood that the conflict had passed its point of easy containment. Economies strained, alliances hardened. Civil defense messaging became routine. The Third World War had not arrived as a sudden catastrophe. It had emerged through accumulation, through systems pushing against their limits, through decisions made under pressure and machines acting within milliseconds. The next phase would not be defined by warnings or demonstrations. It would be defined by whether restraint, already thinning, could survive one more mistake.
By the final week of May, the conflict had settled into a pattern that felt stable only because its instability had become routine. Patrols launched on schedule. Satellites passed overhead in predictable arcs. Civilian news broadcasts spoke of ongoing tensions while quietly preparing populations for the possibility that tensions would soon become something else. The systems of war had achieved continuity. On May 21st at 0511 UTC, a coordinated cyber intrusion struck financial clearing networks in Tokyo and New York simultaneously. Transactions stalled. Automated trading systems halted mid-cycle. Within minutes, backup systems engaged, restoring partial functionality. The interruption lasted 14 minutes. In military terms, it was negligible. In economic terms, it signaled vulnerability. Markets reopened under emergency protocols. Governments issued statements assuring stability. Behind closed doors, finance ministers spoke of contingency currencies and rationed liquidity. The war was now being fought across ledgers as well as oceans. That same day, satellite imagery revealed large-scale mobilization at several Japanese southern bases. Missile batteries moved into hardened positions. Aircraft dispersed across auxiliary runways. Civilian airports in key regions suspended operations under the pretext of maintenance. Evacuation planning began quietly in coastal cities. The public sensed the shift. Grocery stores saw increased purchases of non-perishable food. Fuel stations experienced long lines before authorities imposed purchase limits. The home front was preparing for something that had not yet been announced. On May 22nd, the first confirmed strike on land occurred. At 13:27 local time, a precision-guided missile impacted an unoccupied section of a Japanese military logistics facility on a remote island. The explosion destroyed equipment but caused no immediate casualties. Surveillance footage of the strike circulated globally within hours. Attribution remained officially unassigned. Few doubted its origin. The message was deliberate. The conflict had moved beyond sea and air into territory. Japan responded within hours with a limited retaliatory strike against an isolated radar installation believed to support targeting operations in the region. The strike was calibrated to avoid personnel presence. Infrastructure damaged, no casualties confirmed. Both governments issued statements emphasizing defensive intent. The exchange represented a threshold crossing. Land had been struck. Retaliation had followed. Escalation had become reciprocal. On May 23 at 21:44 UTC, a U.S. carrier group operating east of Taiwan detected multiple high-speed ballistic trajectories launched from coastal batteries. Missile defense systems engaged automatically, several intercepts successful. One missile evaded interception and detonated in proximity to the carrier's escort vessel, causing significant structural damage. Fires broke out across the deck. Damage control teams contained the blaze after nearly an hour. Casualty numbers remained classified initially, then partially released. Dozens injured, several killed. It was the largest single loss of life since the conflict began. The United States elevated its readiness level across all Pacific commands. Additional forces moved into position from Hawaii and the continental mainland. Public statements framed the escalation as an attack on stability rather than a declaration of war. Privately, officials acknowledged the reality. The conflict had entered open combat. Allied nations responded quickly. Australia expanded its naval deployment into the Philippine Sea. The United Kingdom placed additional air assets on forward bases under joint command. South Korea increased surveillance and missile defense readiness across its territory. The Pacific's operational map now included multiple coalition participants, each contributing to a conflict that had grown beyond its initial scope. On May 24th, the first large-scale amphibious exercise by Japanese forces occurred along their southern defensive perimeter. Officially, it was a readiness drill. Satellite imagery suggested something more. Landing craft loaded with equipment moved into staging areas. Air cover intensified. The exercise remained within territorial waters. Its visibility served as a message. Land defense preparations were underway. That same day, the most dangerous incident of the war unfolded. Early warning systems on both sides detected simultaneous launch signatures from multiple coastal regions. For 8 minutes, analysts could not determine whether the signals represented missile tests, decoys, or the opening phase of a strategic exchange. Strategic forces elevated to maximum readiness, submarines received encrypted instructions, aircraft stood ready for immediate launch. Then the signatures disappeared. Later analysis suggested a complex sensor failure triggered by electronic interference and atmospheric conditions. The explanation did little to calm fears. For 8 minutes, the world had stood at the edge of catastrophe without a single deliberate attack. After the incident, emergency communication channels reopened. Messages passed through neutral intermediaries. Both sides agreed unofficially to re-establish certain deconfliction protocols. Yet even as communication improved, the fighting continued. The war had gained momentum independent of diplomacy. On May 25th at 6:38 local time, a major naval battle erupted east of Okinawa. Dozens of surface vessels and hundreds of aircraft converged in overlapping engagement zones. Missiles launched in waves. Air defense systems activated continuously. Electronic warfare filled the sky with interference. Several ships were struck and disabled. Others sank outright. Casualty numbers climbed into the thousands across multiple fleets. The battle lasted nearly 19 hours before both sides disengaged due to ammunition depletion and mounting losses. No decisive victor emerged. The engagement achieved only one outcome: confirmation that the conflict could no longer be contained. Global consequences followed immediately. Shipping routes across the Pacific collapsed as insurers withdrew coverage entirely. Energy prices surged to historic levels. Governments began implementing fuel rationing. Food supply chains faltered in regions dependent on imports. Protests erupted in cities far from the fighting. Emergency powers expanded across multiple nations. The war had reached the global population not through bombs, but through scarcity. On May 26th, the first confirmed strike on a major urban area occurred. A missile intended for a military installation veered off course and detonated on the outskirts of a coastal city. Civilian casualties mounted quickly. Images spread worldwide before censorship systems could contain them. Public opinion hardened across multiple countries. Calls for decisive action replaced earlier appeals for restraint. Political leaders faced pressure to escalate. Japan formally invoked its collective defense agreements. The United States reaffirmed full military support. Allied command structures integrated further. The conflict had become a coalition war in practice, if not yet in name. Additional nations began contributing logistical, intelligence, and cyber capabilities. The operational grid expanded across the entire Pacific Basin. On May 24th, the first large-scale amphibious exercise by Japanese forces occurred along their southern defensive perimeter. Officially, it was a readiness drill. Satellite imagery suggested something more. Landing craft loaded with equipment moved into staging areas. Air cover intensified. The exercise remained within territorial waters. Its visibility served as a message. Land defense preparations were underway. That same day, the most dangerous incident of the war unfolded. Early warning systems on both sides detected simultaneous launch signatures from multiple coastal regions. For 8 minutes, analysts could not determine whether the signals represented missile tests, decoys, or the opening phase of a strategic exchange. Strategic forces elevated to maximum readiness. Submarines received encrypted instructions. Aircraft stood ready for immediate launch. Then the signatures disappeared. Later analysis suggested a complex sensor failure triggered by electronic interference and atmospheric conditions. The explanation did little to calm fears. For 8 minutes, the world had stood at the edge of catastrophe without a single deliberate attack. After the incident, emergency communication channels reopened. Messages passed through neutral intermediaries. Both sides agreed unofficially to re-establish certain deconfliction protocols. Yet even as communication improved, the fighting continued. The war had gained momentum independent of diplomacy. On May 25th at 6:38 local time, a major naval battle erupted east of Okinawa. Dozens of surface vessels and hundreds of aircraft converged in overlapping engagement zones. Missiles launched in waves. Air defense systems activated continuously. Electronic warfare filled the sky with interference. Several ships were struck and disabled. Others sank outright.
Casualty numbers climbed into the thousands across multiple fleets. The battle lasted nearly 19 hours before both sides disengaged due to ammunition depletion and mounting losses. No decisive victor emerged. The engagement achieved only one outcome: confirmation that the conflict could no longer be contained. Global consequences followed immediately. Shipping routes across the Pacific collapsed as insurers withdrew coverage entirely. Energy prices surged to historic levels. Governments began implementing fuel rationing. Food supply chains faltered in regions dependent on imports. Protests erupted in cities far from the fighting. Emergency powers expanded across multiple nations. The war had reached the global population not through bombs, but through scarcity. On May 26, the first confirmed strike on a major urban area occurred. A missile intended for a military installation veered off course and detonated on the outskirts of a coastal city. Civilian casualties mounted.